You are listening to the Danger Tapes podcast with your host, Devin Ramos.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Danger Tapes podcast. My name is Devin Ramos. This week, I have my brother, Darrick Ramos, with me. And if you guys were looking for the podcast last week, I actually didn't drop one. In the previous weeks, I actually dropped, I believe, 3 episodes of the Danger Tapes. One featuring Molly, or actually 2 featuring Molly, and then one of my recap of FYF. And I actually didn't drop one last week. I actually had one recorded. It was a little too depressing for me, so I didn't release it. I was a little drunk, and just didn't seem that professional. So this week we have a much more professional episode. We got a lot of feedback on me and my brother got a lot of feedback on the episode that we released a couple weeks ago, in which we just talked about some of the films we've seen, and we wanted to do the same this week. And we actually seen a good handful of films this time around. With the last episode, we only talked about like 3 films, I think. This one we actually have a nice handful of films that we could talk about. Among them are some of the Criterion movies, actually some of the movies that are featured on the Criterion collection, and also Straight Outta Compton. And also you might have seen some as well, right?
What is that?
I don't know. What are you going to talk about this week?
I have seen a couple of Criterion films that I think basically are really kind of like these stuff that I think is deeper in the Criterion collection, if that's the best way to put it. And mainly that's thanks to our Hulu subscription, because I've seen we're going to talk about Tokyo Drifter, because you said you recently watched that, and I rewatched that. I had seen it first in a Japanese cinema course that I took last year at Long Beach while I was still going to school, and there was a couple of the other films that I've seen within the Criterion collection that I think if you really dig deep, or at least there's certain films that with the exception of Yojimbo, because I kind of wanted to talk about that, but with the other than that, there's a couple. One specifically that is in the Criterion collection that I kind of wanted to discuss today, and it's another Japanese film, and it's entitled The Face of Another, which is basically about a guy who I believe he works in some sort of chemical factory or whatever, and he gets badly scarred from this sort of freak accident that basically happens to him, and he has insurance and he can't really pay for it, and he still urges a plastic surgeon, to basically create a face for him, even though the doctor believes it's morally wrong. And it's kind of a really bizarre film, and I had been wanting to talk about it for a while. I've seen it not recently, but definitely this year. And I don't know, the Criterion collection, at least with the Criterion collection, it's just so deep that sometimes you'll be browsing for movies, whether it's on Amazon or whatever, and you'll find stuff that you really didn't even know was on the Criterion, and a lot of them are really creative films. And I wouldn't go as far as saying they're landmark films, but they're definitely films that I think they're important to have, or I think it's important that there is a company like the Criterion base that kind of preserves these films for people like you and I to watch.
Yeah, there's a lot of films on there that it's funny because they're almost like you've never even heard of them, and they're almost like those real hidden gems that you would almost never even hear about. Kind of like today, in which perhaps even Ex Machina was not seen by a wide audience, but those Criterion movies have a nice collection of those types of films in which they may have not been seen by a wide audience, and they may have been overshadowed by movies, the big blockbusters of their time, such as Jaws or A Fistful of Dollars, in which these films were prominent around in their time, but they just didn't get that recognition.
Right, definitely, and I think it's crazy, because I definitely think that if it wasn't for the Criterion collection, not a lot of people would know who Akira Kurosawa is, and the fact that like basically I think I don't know if this is fact or not, but it's definitely, I think it's safe to say that probably Kurosawa has the most films on Criterion Collection, if not one of the directors with the most films on the Criterion Collection. And it's kind of like you said with A Fistful of Dollars, and this kind of tie into Yojimbo is I don't think a lot of people knew, or maybe huge film buffs do, but not a lot of people know that Yojimbo is what served as the inspiration for Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. And some people probably do, and the crazy thing about that is I think if it wasn't for, just like you said, if it wasn't for the Criterion Collection, then we wouldn't have Yojimbo to look back at and really see that it is kind of that A Fistful of Dollars is essentially a remake of that. And what I really kind of want to discuss, and even though we didn't get to go, was recently at Quentin Tarantino's theater, the New Beverly, they had a double feature with Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, and that's like, I mean, that would have been really cool for me to see, because those are two of my favorite films, and I think both films are definitely cool in their own right, and they have something unique about them, but it would have just been so cool to see one back to back and kind of compare the two, and just seeing how like one mirrors the other, or rather how A Fistful of Dollars mirrors Yojimbo, because Yojimbo is one of my favorite films.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it was a shame that we didn't get to go. Because that is something that the New Beverly is really good at doing, is sort of giving you that back to back action. But otherwise, anything else that you've actually seen lately?
Well, like I said, I rewatched Tokyo Drifter, which was kind of which going back and rewatching it from seeing it a year ago, it's definitely, I think after we watched Tokyo Drifter, we watched a couple of other Yakuza movies. Not maybe certain people know this, or maybe they do, but the Yakuza film in Japan, at least, it's kind of its own genre, in the same sense that over here in Western cinema we have the mafia film, or the gangster film, and Tokyo Drifter is one of these weird Yakuza movies that I think, if you kind of look at Kurosawa's, one of his most prominent Yakuza movies, I think he directed one or two or three, maybe several at least, films about Yakuza. There's one entitled Drunken Angel, and that's really more, it's definitely more dramatic, in terms of maybe not melodrama, but it's definitely, the performances are more organic, and they're very realistic. But Tokyo Drifter, in a sense, is almost a parody of the Yakuza film, and that's not to take away and say that it's not a good movie, and definitely a good watch. Kind of in watching it though, I don't think there's much to analyze about it, and I think that's a good thing, because not every film is meant to be analyzed, but it's definitely a film that, if you do get a chance to check it out at any point in time, it's really cool to watch, because one thing that I really love about Tokyo Drifter is how well, and I don't know the director's name, but how well the shots are composed. There's really nice foreground, middleground, and background that you get in a lot of those shots in Tokyo Drifter. They have a lot of really nice depth, and the way he plays with shapes such as squares, and he has a lot of bird's eye shots, and it's really, in a sense, kind of like a comic book, and that's kind of beating the whole comic book genre over the head, but it really is just, it's really just composed or photographed beautifully in terms of balance and depth and everything like that.
Would you even say it's like a manga?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's kind of strange about Tokyo Drifter is kind of like how it's kind of like this, there's like this sense of there's Tokyo and Japan, and it's like it's playing between the real and kind of like, I guess, subconscious in a way, going back to those sets that are kind of like these jazz clubs where everything is is kind of like fluid and kind of, I guess, to apply it back to jazz, if you kind of look at certain jazz elements or everything like that, people kind of say it's free range. So it's kind of fitting that when they're gunfighting or having these gunfights or climactic fights in these jazz clubs, there's really just a bunch of chaos, because I think jazz is kind of a very similar type of music, and that's kind of portrayed in certain club scenes. You know, when they go inside the club, everything seems a lot more wild and entertaining inside of the clubs than it does actually in the street. Mm-hmm. Everything in the street in Tokyo seems very calm and, you know, smooth and easygoing. And then when they get inside these clubs, it's just wild, and there's different sort of shapes and stairwells and everything. And it's really odd. And I think that's the best way to analyze it. If you were going to analyze it, I don't think it's anything that really needs to be go into super depth about it or anything like that. But I think now, kind of reflecting on it in terms of jazz being really like this huge influence in the film and soundtrack, I think it is kind of like the clubs definitely kind of mimic jazz music.
Yeah, I think one thing about the music was that, and it actually kind of ties into the humor of the film, was that it was really funny the way you kind of see, you go into the club. Well, the characters would go into the club, and then they would kind of go into these back rooms, and then the music would be playing, and as soon as they shut the door, the music would stop playing, and then they would have like these really like sort of mobster type scenes or Yakuza type scenes in which all of them are discussing business. Some of them are getting shot at, and or some of them are getting beaten, and it kind of ties into the humor of the film, in which it was really funny and almost like Coen Brothers like, or almost Tarantino like, in which just the way these sort of the music and then the violence sort of juxtapose each other. It was just, to me, it was really humorous to watch, and that's what kind of kept me into it, because I think if it didn't have that humor in the film, I think it would have been a lot harder for me to watch, even though visually it was appealing, because it was subtitled. I don't think that the story was so much strong as it was just a funny film in which the characters are really animated. And like we said, it was just a lot like a manga, in which there were various shapes played with. The storytelling was just very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Just sort of, it wasn't as traditional as it was as another straightforward movie. And it was just fun to watch all around.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think one thing that is kind of, basically kind of like weird about that film is the use of diegetic and non-diegetic sound, and that's kind of like how basically they use something as simple as the main character Tetsu kind of whistling, and it's very odd that like he's whistling or singing to himself, but it not only is it playing through the soundtrack, or basically used as through the soundtrack, but it's also being used through what the characters can hear, such as when there's that one scene when they're in the kind of on the outskirts of Tokyo, and Tetsu's whistling to himself, and you know they could hear him from like a distance or even outside of the door, and that's kind of like you said, very humorous. Like they'll go inside of a club, and the minute they close the door, you can't hear anything, and it's just completely silent. And I think that's kind of, it's very an odd film, and that's kind of what it's something as simple as that, where you would be taken out of the film. It kind of keeps you in, and it kind of just draws you in, and it kind of makes you pay more attention to what's going on in the film and the dialogue and the kind of things that these people are saying. And with even though you know the music should be there and it's not, it's kind of this cool little quirky thing about the film that kind of carries on throughout. You know, in a sense, there's even those little music breaks in between that kind of make the film somewhat of a musical, because of Tetsu singing to himself and drifting throughout Tokyo and everything like that. And that's another cool little thing about the film, at least that kind of keeps you, you know, drawn into it. Because otherwise, if these things weren't in the film, I don't think it would be as entertaining.
Right. No, I agree with you. And moving on, I know we've been talking a lot about Straight Outta Compton, and I know a lot of other people have been talking about it, but I don't feel like when other people talk about it. Not to say that they don't realize it, but I feel like the points that me and Darrick here have touched upon, through text message, I don't feel like they've been touched upon as much. And definitely for me, when I watched Straight Outta Compton, I say Straight Outta Compton, definitely for me, one of the best parts of it was definitely the sound. If you can see Straight Outta Compton in a theater in which has paid a lot of put a lot of attention into their sound system, to me, you'll leave so much more satisfied. Just because I think, not so much because of the hip hop element, which there definitely was, in the background of some scenes, you could hear Wu-Tang, you could hear the development of some of Dr. Dre's beats. But I think what the movie did really well was bring in a sense of what was the influence in the music culture before NWA really became prominent. And to me, that's what really, really made me excited when I was watching the film. It was a really good film all around. I enjoyed a lot of the scenes, and I enjoyed the history of it and watching, these real people develop. And as soon as I knew where some of these moments, I knew what was going to occur after some of these moments. But I think the most enjoyable part for me was definitely the beginning, in which you could hear, the influences of George Clinton. You could hear the influences of, I believe, Planet Rock. And it was so much fun to hear all of this type of music inside of that film and hear all of that influence.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I thought was kind of a cool little thing about the movie is it's definitely a postmodern movie. And I don't know, postmodernism is kind of a heavy subject within itself, but to kind of touch upon basically what postmodernism is, it's kind of described as this, not so much a genre, but a period after the 1980s, kind of like what we're living in now. We're really influenced by technology and just different things. There's kind of like the bricolage and there's basically the combining of genres and just a lot of different type of characteristics that kind of embody what postmodernism is. And what I kind of saw that stood out as postmodernism to me about Straight Outta Compton is at least, well, one thing, and this is something that I think a lot of other reviewers have been saying too, is that Straight Outta Compton kind of plays out like a superhero movie. And if it were to be combined with another genre, it would be the documentary. And I think that sounds bizarre if you really think about it, but it that one of the characteristics of postmodernism is basically the genres clashing. For instance, Blade Runner is this noir film mixed with science fiction. Now in the case of Straight Outta Compton, they basically portray these characters as the forming of this sort of superhero team, with the two main villains kind of being Suge Knight and Jerry Heller. Aside from that, some of the way they kind of introduce these characters and definitely a lot of at least to me, the way the concert scenes were kind of shot are really in this sort of documentary perspective, and they also do kind of mesh in the old kind of newsreel footage and everything like that, especially with Eazy after he's diagnosed with HIV, and then Dr. Dre's the whole little montage at the end, basically using this kind of archival footage. And then aside from that, there's one of the things that postmodernism also embodies is hyperrealism, or rather the inability to differentiate between what's real and what's fiction. And well, the way I kind of seen that was probably the best example of that is Tupac basically kind of seeming almost as if the actor who portrayed him was actually Tupac, because he looked very similar to Tupac. And I think there's even characters like Ice Cube and even certain scenes with Eazy, and looking at older pictures of Dr. Dre, I think the actors do kind of resemble this sort of odd, almost maybe bizarro type of character, that it kind of looks like the way certain scenes play out, that you are watching documentary footage that was maybe shot in HD in the 90s. And of course we all know that's not possible, but I mean, those are just two of the main characteristics. And finally, the third is the referencing of other texts, at least whether it's film, literature, or television, sound, music. And I think a lot of people probably missed, or maybe they didn't, but I know a lot of people got the Bye Felicia reference. But I think what really kind of stood out to me the most in reference to other texts was kind of how they referenced Ice Cube writing Friday, and that in itself is also a film that Gary Gray directed as well. 20 years before this film came out, but they do have these quirky little references, or not quirky, but these little small references that you kind of go out and you're able to catch. And again, this is just all my understanding of it. I'm not trying to make something like really go into a deep analysis or try to make myself sound brilliant, but it's kind of how the movie was, played out in my head, at least.
Yeah. I think, when I seen it, when I had originally heard that they were making this movie, I have to admit I was a bit skeptical. I really enjoyed it, though. I think that with all the analysis that you brought to the table when you actually told me about it, it made a lot of sense to me. To me, I was more looking at accuracy, and like I said, I was definitely looking at sound. And there is a lot of criticism coming, and it's a lot of correct criticism, because one of the things that I did catch was that the portrayal of Dr. Dre, in which it almost makes him look naive to what's going on around him, and almost like he wasn't a part of all the troublesome behavior that was going on around him. And clearly, I mean, all you really have to do is Google Dr. Dre, and him beating the journalist back then and beating his, I believe, his ex-girlfriend from back in the day. All you really have to do is look for that. And to me, I've taken classes in which they sort of explain why these things happen. Not so much to say that these things should be justified in any way, but all you really have to do is dig beneath the surface and look. Like, Dr. Dre is a prominent figure now because of his headphones, and because of the fact that he is a part of a multi-billion-dollar company, Apple. They're going to try to portray Dr. Dre in the best way possible. There's too much money at stake. The fact that those things were not touched upon in the movie are makes the movie dishonest, of course. Otherwise, I think it was a really accurate movie. I think the portrayal of Ice Cube was really accurate in the way he separated from the group, and the way he started his own thing on the East Coast. I think that was really accurate. I think the Eazy-E thing was really accurate. And I really didn't find that they sugarcoated anything else other than Dr. Dre's, part in the movie. I think it would have been a little bit, not so much enjoyable, but it would have been a little bit more truthful if they had actually touched upon those things.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people had a problem with the accuracy, and I mean, overall, aside from all the bullshit, like, whether Dr. Dre's portrayed as this kind of naive, super kind of like protagonist type of character, almost like a Boy Scout in a sense, that's a little weird. But I mean, for something that when I first heard about this movie, definitely I kind of had the same thoughts that you were, that it was probably going to be like the, Biggie movie. And even though I didn't see the Biggie movie, I know it was not really well received by a lot of critics and audiences, and I was actually pretty surprised at how entertaining the film is in general. And aside from the fact that, looking at it from this perspective of it being this postmodern film, and the fact that Ice Cube was kind of portrayed as, even Ice Cube in a sense is kind of portrayed as this sort of antagonistic or anti-hero character, as opposed to Dr. Dre. And aside from all that, I definitely think it's an entertaining movie. And if you, I think a lot of people would enjoy it. And like although last thing I want to say is, even though I did joke around and say it's my favorite superhero movie, it does very well play out like a superhero movie, and it's really a cool way to kind of look at it. And I think it was in the intentions definitely of the director Gary Gray to kind of, use kind of the same elements that Marvel movies are using to kind of tell the origin stories of their characters, and kind of use that format in a movie about rappers. And it's very entertaining, and I think that's kind of why it was such a success. Even though a lot of people may not pick up on that angle, it's definitely there if you're kind of familiar with superhero films and you kind of approach it from that perspective. So I urge people to kind of approach it from that perspective, and even if you don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. But if you haven't seen it and you listen to this podcast, and tell me what you think about whether it's kind of like the superhero postmodern weird movie that I don't know, it's kind of a weird movie, but it struck me in a weird way, but in a kind of good weird way, because I really did enjoy it.
Yeah. And definitely I wanted to touch upon in our last 5 minutes. I actually watched, I believe it's Guillermo del Toro's first film, entitled Kronos, and that is also a part of the Criterion Collection right now, but I'm sure you can find it in various other places. But it's a really strange movie. I actually started watching the movie not knowing it was Guillermo del Toro's. I didn't look at who directed it. I didn't look who the actors were. And then it made sense as it started going along. I mean, I didn't realize, it was his film until the very end, but it made sense as it was going along, that because Ron Perlman was in it, and then you start to put together all these pieces, the way, they use makeup in the film, and the way they use sort of this, it's almost like just a modern day monster film, in which you would have seen maybe Boris Karloff, being portrayed as, the modern day Prometheus, I suppose, the monster in Frankenstein. It's almost like this modern day monster movie, and to me, it was just a really cool film to watch. I mean, like I said, I didn't know who the director was, but there wasn't a lot of special effects in it. It was just a really good story-driven film. The actors weren't like above and beyond what you would see in any other film, but it was just kind of really fun to watch. I mean, if you go and watch something like Pan's Labyrinth, if you go and watch Hellboy, not so much Pacific Rim. I didn't really enjoy that one as much as I thought I would have. It was still fun to watch, though. But Kronos, I think, is just one of those movies that all around was just good, because it had a good story, had a good mythos to it, in which they had this old ancient Mexico sort of alchemist building this machine for an ancient king that would allow him to be immortal. He builds it, and then the civilization gets destroyed, and the machine is found much, much later, modern day, by this antiques dealer. Believe the antiques dealer is in his like mid-60s. And it allows him to continue living, makes him feel younger. And in a sense, he almost starts to get addicted to the power, but it's taken away from him very early on in the film. But it shows him dealing with his immortality and dealing with the fact that he may not be able to die, and he has this hunger that he must be able to feed. And I know you haven't watched it yet. I don't know if you will be watching it, but I do recommend it if you do really enjoy Guillermo del Toro's films. I know I do, like I said, for the most part, but I'm not sure. Like I said, I honestly didn't expect it to be his film. It was cool to watch.
I'll probably have to definitely check it out soon, when I get the time. And I do enjoy doing podcasts like this. It's cool to kind of talk about what we watch, and I think a lot of people enjoy listening to it. So it's definitely cool. So, if you listen to it and you have any recommendations for movies that you want us to check out, then I think that'd be cool too. And let us know.
Yeah,
definitely.
I mean, definitely, we want to talk about these things on the podcast when Darrick's around in town. We're gonna find other ways to do it. Like I said, I apologize to you guys for not having an episode last week. They will be regular again every Monday. This is actually, I believe, the 4th year of the podcast. This would be like the official 4th year podcast. I don't know what episode it is, but I'm glad you guys are enjoying the podcast so far. Like I said, I'm always trying to clean them up. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud and any other place that you're listening to us on. Anything else you want to say before we go?
Thanks for listening. we'll be back with more films to talk about because it's definitely enjoyable.